Every career and field of study has its own unique tools of the trade, the equipment and skills necessary to do a job properly. It is important to understand what the proper tools of a trade are before beginning a project, or the project will either not succeed or take a longer time to accomplish it. While it is theoretically possible to build a house without a saw or hammer, the job is going to take a long time and will not be as well built as one where the carpenter has used the proper tools. The study of history is no different. Historians and students of history have their own tools of the trade, which may not fill a toolbox made by craftsmen, but are the techniques and practices that allow a historian to properly research and present historical information to their audiences, whether that audience be academia, a classroom of high schoolers, or the general public. The tools of the trade that will be unpacked in this video are the lenses of history. Now, these are the different schools of thought when working in history. They provide the framework for how a historian approaches a historical topic. Related to that are the fields of history. While the lenses are about how a historian approaches a topic, fields of history are the various topics themselves. Historians also must have the tools necessary to develop research questions and theses to add to the conversation of a given topic. Other tools that must be pulled out of the toolbox include causation, interpretation, and neutrality, and proper citations. And finally, the historian must finish the project off with the final tool of narrative and argumentative writing. Historians view history through several different lenses. Each lens looks at history from a different perspective and in a different light. These lenses will affect the methods and theories a historian uses and even the topics a historian will choose. Each of the historical lenses here has specific theories associated with them and will discuss particular fields of study, each of which has a series of areas of study under those. Intellectual history studies the history of ideas and thinkers. Examples include the history of the theory of evolution, the history of theological concepts, or the history of property ownership laws. Intellectual history studies these ideas in the context of their creator, historical era, and the culture and the societies of the creators. It can deal with the range of topics from art to law, science to religion, and many other areas of study. The key theory of intellectual history is that ideas cannot be separated from the time and culture of their creator. Political history studies the movements, political parties, politicians, constitutions, and governments of various countries. Political history is an offshoot of the history of political thought, which would fall under the domain of intellectual history, but it includes more than just the ideas behind politics, but also the movements that result from those ideas. It can focus on the elites in power or the little guy, or anyone in between. Most political historians are American and focus on U.S. history. Many fields of history dovetail nicely with political history, but the main emphasis is on the politics that result from the ideas of the intellectual histories. Social history is broken into two main theories: old social history and new social history. Old social history focuses on economics and Marxist history, usually associated with historical materialism. This is the idea that everything is driven by economics and follows a very specific set of laws. New social history came out of the 1960s student social movements, which were made up of mostly white male liberals. These new left historians focused on social structures, rejecting the traditional social historian Marxism. Historical revisionism was birthed out of the new social movement, with a revision of several previously held perspectives. New social history covers many fields of history, such as women's history, racial theory, labor history, entertainment history, social and cultural movements, to name a few. As a reminder, fields of history are the topics that a historian studies, but these topics here all follow specific theories of history and are therefore lumped together under the lens of social history. Cultural history looks at the way people affect the culture in which they live and how cultures affect the people. Cultural history can use as its source material resources that at first glance may not seem to be historical in nature, such as film, music, and art. The theories of cultural history focus on the personal and social lives of people, examining the traditions, beliefs, and moral values, often in how these are combined through the arts. Societies change over time, and cultural history examines those changes, looking at how older cultures affect younger ones. An example of this can be how the counterculture movements of America have changed over the years, as seen through the music in the countercultural scene. Another popular lens is gender history. This is not women's history, which is a field of history that can be part of gender history, but can also be found in political, social, or cultural history, depending on the topic being discussed. Gender history studies power structures, as does postcolonial history, which will be discussed momentarily. Gender history sees the social and political roles associated with gender as social constructs, with men and women experiencing the world differently. Gender history often focuses on how power structures in a given culture are affected by the culture's views on masculinity and femininity. Under the umbrella of gender history, the fields of study include discussions of labor history, cultural trends, war, language studies, and political systems, again, using the theories of gender history to discuss those fields. Related to gender history is post-colonial history. Instead of focusing on gender and gender roles, this lens focuses on the effects of colonialism from the point of view of the subjugated. Its theories are a reaction against colonialism, and the major issues examined are the legacy of colonialism on society, culture, and politics, and the post-colonial identity. Two final historical lenses to discuss are world history and global history. These may sound similar, but there are distinct differences. World history is usually comparative, examining how events affected different parts of the world. An example of this would be a comparison of the effects of the 7 Years' War, known to most Americans as the French and Indian War, on the economies and governments of the American colonies and Mother England. England entered a time of great economic downturn with a huge debt load from the war, but the American colonies enjoyed a time of prosperity as a result of the defeat of the major economic rivals in America, the French. Global history, on the other hand, is truly global. It examines trends and issues that affect the entire world, such as the history of Christianity or topics related to globalization. After deciding a historical lens to study history through and narrowing down into a field of study, historians still need to drill down deeper into a specific topic. There are several ways to find a topic to research. One of the easiest is to perform a Google search. This allows a historian to get a basic knowledge of what has been written already on a topic, to see if there are journal articles, newspaper or magazine articles on the subject, basically to see if the topic is already part of the historical culture. Another easy method of choosing a topic is to pick a topic of personal interest or a topic of previous study that can be built off. One of the most important questions to ask about a topic deals with sources. Are there enough sources to dive into the topic deeply? Can the questions raised about a topic be reasonably answered with the available sources? The type of source materials and where to find them will be discussed in just a moment, but first, another key concept is that any new research or writing must be an addition to the topic and should not be a simple regurgitation of other researchers or historians. Look for uncertainties, debates, or trends that can provide new avenues of research for the topic. When writing history, historians aim to convince their audience of the truth of the author's views. To do this, the writer must have a clear thesis. So, what is a thesis? It's important to note that a thesis is not an argument. An argument is a statement made to persuade an audience of a point. A thesis is made up of an argument as well as a statement of how the argument will be proven true. For example, the statement, "The candidate that spends the most money on political ads will usually win the presidency," is an argument. But a thesis would be, "The candidate that spends the most money on political ads has a greater chance of winning the presidency, as seen in FEC campaign finance reports." Proper historical writing must have a clear thesis stated early in the writing. There are a variety of sources that can be used in researching a topic. One of the most accessible sources is monographs. Monographs are detailed written studies on a specific topic, usually published in book form. These are often the best place to start for historians, as they are easily found in journal book reviews and in libraries. Monographs can provide a better understanding of current views on topics and can provide questions for further study, which might provide new topics for research. Historiographies are another source of material. Historiographies are the history of the writing on a topic, and they can make great starting points for source material. Reading through historiographies will present a variety of source materials, both primary and secondary sources. Scholarly journals can also provide a better understanding of finer points in a topic that may not be complete enough or broad enough for a full monograph. A key point in favor of the scholarly journal is that they are peer-reviewed, making it often a more reliable source than monographs, which may be published with less strict of a review process. Other places to search for sources include libraries, archives, museums, source collections such as collections of war journals or letters. And another thing to consider when searching for source materials is the location of the material. Archives and museums are scattered around the world, making access somewhat difficult unless a major university or research center is nearby. The digitization of many archives makes it easier to search online for research, but the process can take time. The collected letters of King George III were only released online in 2017, over 200 years after his insanity forced him to accept the regency of 1811. Causation is another tool in the historian's toolbox. Events in history do not happen in isolation, but rather have other previous events that lead to the event in question. The study of causation is the study of those events. There are two main types of causation that historians look at. Necessary causes are the events that are necessary for an event in question to occur. Sufficient causes are the direct actions that lead to an event, but only because the necessary causes have already been met. For example, the necessary causes that led to World War I included a rise in militarism due to imperialism, a budding nationalism, and a complicated series of mutual defense alliances. The sufficient cause was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip. Causation is an important tool in history, as history studies change over time, and for events to fully be explained, their causes must be discussed. Interpretation happens in every piece of historical writing, and so it is important to understand a few points about it. Historians interpret the sources they use, analyzing, evaluating, and explaining events. History is often believed to be the past, but what is read as history is actually the interpretations of the past by the authors of the monograph or the journal article. As research uncovers new data, it is normal to find historians reinterpreting historical events. In his book, The Historian's Toolbox, Williams discusses the historiography of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The original view was that the dropping of the bombs was the only way to end the war in Japan, but in the 1960s, historians began to reinterpret the events surrounding the bombs. These Cold War-era historians believe that the dropping of the bomb was about impressing Stalin and reminding him of the might of the U.S. as a power struggle loomed between them. So what was the real reason? This is the role of interpretation in history. This would also be a great time to bring up the issue of neutrality. Historians will inevitably have personal biases, but the work of historians is to write, not out of their biases, but out of the evidence presented in the available source material. If source material is available, historians should present it and not hide it if it discloses information that might be counter to their argument. They should not pretend that it doesn't exist. In addition, when examining source material, historians must be careful to examine any biases in the writers of the original materials. When writing monographs or journal articles, proper historical practice is for historians to include citations for the work that has been referenced. There are several reasons for this tool of citation. First, it gives credit where credit is due. Historical writing must add new information or points of view to a topic, and most historical writers, though, will reference what other historians have written. When doing so, they will use citations to point where the information came from. This allows other historians to examine the sources to see if the argument presented is valid. It's also the ethical thing to do. Quoting someone without giving them credit is plagiarism, which is intellectual theft. Historians use two main methods of citing sources: footnotes and bibliographies. Footnotes are the preferred method of citing sources in the main text, as they allow the reader to see the information without having to flip back and forth in the article or book. Footnotes are also useful for presenting additional information that might disrupt the narrative, such as research models used or data that would bog down the primary text. There are two general types of bibliographies used by historians: reference lists and annotated bibliographies. Reference lists not only gather the works cited in the main text, but also include other resources used by the author. Annotated bibliographies include the sources that are found in a reference list, but also include a discussion about the source's research question, thesis, and sources. Historians must write about historical events in a way that appeals to their audience. While many fields of study can be full of technical jargon, try reading a genetics journal, history can use ordinary language to explain past events. Narrative writing is one of the most important tools in the historian's toolbox. Without it, a historian may have a great argument and have the sources to back it up, but will fall flat and not convince others of the truth of their claims. Narrative writing takes simple data, such as a list of figures or dates, and makes a story out of them. But a historian is not simply a storyteller. The writing must present an argument or a thesis and work to prove it. In a way, the great debate between whether history is a science or an art finds its full answer in this tool. It truly takes a synthesis of scientist and artist to write a compelling, argumentative narrative.